Good afternoon, everyone, or happy middle of the night if you're jet lagged like me and didn't sleep. For those of you who I haven't met, my name's Nabil. I work at a company called Worldpay from FIS. I'm guessing most of you have never heard about Worldpay, and probably all of you have never heard about FIS. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the company, we're the largest public company headquartered in Florida. We have about 75,000 employees. And what we do is we provide all of the back-end infrastructure, software, business process outsourcing, and other services and products into the banking, capital markets, and merchant ecosystem. So there's about 6,000 banks in the world that run on our software, about 2,000 different capital markets companies that use our trade execution software, and about 1.5 million merchants that process about $2 trillion annually that use our fiat payment rails. So you might think based on that, I'm going to talk about payments or something to do with financial services, but actually I talk about that all the time, and that's really Web 2 and really TradFi, and this is a Web 3 conference. So what I thought I'd do is talk about something that I personally find interesting, and that's kind of the future of governance for financial services in particular going forward. And I find this interesting for a couple of reasons. One is I work at a very large, often bureaucratic company, and so the thought of like a better way to govern an institution like that is interesting. The second is I'm a libertarian at heart, and so the thought of like decentralized governance and people doing things for themselves is also interesting. And so what I want to kind of ground us in is if you start from like the beginning of society, humans have always looked for ways to organize themselves. If you think about hunter-gatherers, they organize themselves in tribes, and the goal of that was survival. If you think about governments, they organize the people and the state to pursue national interests. If you think about executives at a company, they organize workers and resources for monetary or non-monetary objectives. Now, the reality is that most of us, we're not going to be CEOs. We're not going to be presidents or politicians or whatever. And so instead of being the organizer, we're going to be the organized. Or instead of being the coordinator, we're going to be the coordinated. So I think a lot of people are like starting to realize this and starting to be a little bit dissatisfied with how institutions today are being run. Some people are dissatisfied with governments, and we see that in like low approval ratings for most Western democracies today. Some people are dissatisfied with the financial services ecosystem, as an example. And so I think DAOs are really interesting because they give us a way to kind of rethink this. And why are they interesting? I think two reasons, which are kind of self-explanatory in the not very attractive name. One is they're decentralized, so anybody can participate. You don't need to be an elected politician. You don't need to be wealthy. You don't need to have a certain skill set. And the second is they're autonomous, right? I think we're all pretty bullish on the future of smart contracts and this whole concept of code is law. And so to the extent that we can automate away certain aspects of governance that suck a lot of bandwidth out of today's institutions, that's really interesting. And to be honest, DAOs aren't that new of a concept, actually. So when I was doing a little bit of research, I found that the first mention of a DAO was actually in the 1990s, around when the internet was taking off. And it kind of died out. You know, no one really did anything with it. And then, of course, Vitalik brought it back in 2013. And if you fast forward to today, there's quite a few DAOs that probably you guys are familiar with. There's Aave, one of the large DeFi protocols. There's Uniswap, one of the world's largest decentralized exchanges. But despite all this promise and some interesting use cases and the fact that a lot of people think governance systems of today are really ineffective, DAOs haven't really taken off. If you look at in the crypto ecosystem, the percent of crypto assets that are controlled by DAOs is less than 1%. And if you talk about DAOs outside of the crypto and Web3 ecosystem, 99% of people are going to have no idea what you're talking about. And I think there's a couple kind of key barriers or key challenges that exist in the world today that are really going to prevent DAOs from actually being successful in any kind of near or medium term future. So one is, probably not surprising to you, regulatory. So DAOs as an organization are not really recognized in most Western countries as a form of association. I think there's like 2 US states that have said, we recognize DAOs as something. Other than that, pretty much nobody does. Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but if you want to go into a regulated industry like financial services, if you're not a registered organization, how are you going to sign up to pay taxes? How are you going to sign up to give your employees benefits? How are you going to get a bank account? How are you going to nominate people who are going to be your kind of liable directors with regulators? So this whole concept of like DAOs not being a recognized legal entity is actually a pretty big barrier today. And a lot of people would say, there's a lot of similarities with corporations or partnerships or whatever. But I think if you talk to a true kind of DAO enthusiast, they would probably vomit at the thought of you classifying them as a corporation or a partnership. And some people might say, okay, screw it. I don't care if the government's going to recognize me. I'm just going to go create my product, whatever it is. And it's going to be decentralized, and we're going to be all over the world, and we're going to offer it, and they can't regulate us because we're global, distributed, whatever. There was a company that many of you guys might have heard of. It's called B0X. It's been in the news this week. They said they were unstoppable. Literally in their company description, it says they're unstoppable. So they're a DAO. And this week, the US CFTC fined them $250,000 and basically filed a lawsuit against the two founders. And the lawsuit basically said, we don't care that you're a decentralized or distributed DAO. You're basically functioning as an unincorporated association, and you, the two founders, are personally responsible for what's going on with this company. So $250,000 isn't a lot of money for most companies. But this precedent of setting the kind of founders or leaders of a DAO as responsible in the eyes of a major regulator for the activities of that DAO, even though there was no entity registered in that country, that's pretty significant. That's a pretty significant statement from a regulator. And you can bet that other regulators around the world are watching. So if you are thinking about starting a DAO and going down that path and just doing what you want, I would encourage you to think twice. Second is just general human bandwidth and capacity. So it's kind of a funny situation. We, as humans, we have more resources and technology available to us than at any point in history, pretty much. But we're all still incredibly busy. If you look at like the hours of work for most Western countries, they started to decline during the Industrial Revolution. But as we've gone into this internet age, they've crept back up. So we're actually like working more, even though we have more resources at our disposal. And so what this means to me is, I don't think a lot of us really have time to participate in a DAO for a lot of the institutions or companies or whatever they might be that govern our life. I actually have a question. How many of you are part of like a homeowners association? Anybody? I am. Yeah. A few of you. Mance is. Yeah. So think about this. For most people, the biggest asset or most important source of wealth you'll ever have is your home. But how many of you who are in a homeowners association actually actively participate and pay attention to what the heck is going on in that association? I know I don't. I basically ignore it. So if I'm not even like paying attention to this association where I'm like contributing to the management of my biggest asset, how likely am I to participate in the active management of a DAO for my health insurance company or my utility company or my sports club or whatever? So this whole notion that like everybody wants to manage and have an input into every, institution or company that they're interacting with is actually not really true. And I think there's a lot of examples of that. And personally, I prefer to trust the experts on all those things. They're not always going to get it right. Everybody knows that. But if you're like a true kind of free market capitalist, one of the founding theories or basic theories of that is that the economy is the best when everybody focuses at what they're most productive or passionate about. So if you're a human and you're trying to participate in managing or governing everything, that's actually not productive for society as a whole. The third is today's world is super complex. It's very global. There's a lot of issues. I don't think anybody would deny that. And I think the challenge I see, and this isn't a criticism, it's just where the industry is most DAOs are trying to apply really, really simple governance structures and frameworks and philosophies onto the associations that they're governing. And that might work if you're doing something in a video game with a very narrow audience and a narrow use case and forgive this, but not really practical consequences for anybody. That's not true if you're trying to stand up a DAO to provide a regulated service or do something like money movement or healthcare or whatever, right? Like the consequences of misgoverning something complex like that are pretty significant. And I think most of these decisions that DAOs are making, they're often, binary yes/no votes or majority versus minority or, best economic utility or whatever they might be. But the reality is, I think most of us would agree that in a complex enterprise or in a government, issues aren't really black and white like that. They're shades of gray. And today, I don't really think a lot of the governance principles have the ability to capture that. And finally, I don't think anybody's come up with a good way to kind of solve the accountability issue that exists in DAOs. So if you think about a person at work today, if you make a bad decision or a series of bad decisions, you might not get a bonus. You might get fired. You might not have a reference for your next job. So there's like a lot of like powerful incentive structures that exist today to avoid bad decisions. Now, what happens in a DAO if a DAO makes a series of bad decisions? Is it the fault of the person who put forth the proposals that were bad? Is it the fault of the majority who voted for those proposals? Is it the fault of the founders of the DAO, the largest shareholders in the DAO? I don't know. And then what would you actually do to hold them accountable for those bad decisions, assuming you could identify who they are? Would you take away economic utility? Would you diminish their future voting power? Would you diminish the ability for them to put forth future proposals? You could do many of those things, but how do you get the balance of incentivizing participation without making them scared of getting it wrong or getting punished? So I don't really think anyone solved it. So are these few issues I've talked about solvable? Yeah, of course. It's 2022. Like, everyone's smart. We can solve a lot of things. But I don't see us getting there in the near midterm. I think DAOs could become a recognized form of association like we've seen in a couple US states. But my guess is that when a lot of countries do that, they probably are going to be pretty similar to how they treat existing forms of associations today. And could technology automate away a lot of the complexity and, define a million shades of gray in decision making? Yeah, it maybe could. And could we code around that complexity to automate a lot of the decision making such that humans could participate and not have it be a massive drain on our bandwidth? Yeah, it's hypothetically possible. And could we build in accountability mechanisms that balance, the incentivizing of participation, but also the holding accountable of those who are, negatively impacting the DAO? Yes, it's all possible. But if you ask me, I think we're a pretty long way away from any of that. And I'm not convinced that when we do solve all those issues, that endpoint is going to look a lot different than the institutions and enterprises and governance structures that we have in place today. Because the reality is a lot of those governance structures are built on 1,000+ years of collective shared human experience. So for my money, I think DAOs for financial services right now are a fantasy. But like I said at the beginning, I'm a libertarian. And so if anybody feels differently, I would absolutely love if you can come up to me afterwards and convince me otherwise. Thank you.